All right, it's down there. This meeting will come to order. All right, welcome everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Middle East peace process from former U.S. negotiators to the Middle East peace process. I thank our witnesses for appearing today. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement, followed by the ranking member. I am grateful that everyone is here today to hear from these important witnesses. For nearly 50 years, the United States has sought to facilitate an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to bring peace to the Middle East. And since the signing of the Oslo agreements in 1993, Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama have made various attempts to further negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, all with the underlying assumption that peace could not be imposed, but that it had to come from the parties themselves. Since 2002, the United States policy has supported the idea of direct negotiations between the two parties, leading to two states for two peoples living side by side in peace and security. This has been the position of successive Republican and Democratic administrations. At times, politics and personalities have been bigger than policy disagreements. There is no doubt that it will take courage on both sides to come to an historic agreement. But it is in the United States' interest to see a safe and secure Israel living side by side in peace with a prosperous Palestinian state. And while the United States cannot impose a peace plan, it can, and it has, served as a convener and facilitator of talks. The United States has set forth framework agreements predicated on the core idea of 1967 borders with mutually agreed upon land swaps, beginning with the Madrid Conference in 1991, Clinton's Oslo I and II, the Bush Roadmap, through the Obama administration's framework agreement. Last month, it was the Trump administration's turn to release its long-awaited peace proposal. At the outset, many questioned the timing of the plan's release. The Palestinians had cut off communication with the administration for nearly 2 years following the move of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. Israel, in state of electoral paralysis for nearly a year, is just weeks away from its third election. The U.S. presidential election is in November. Now, I don't know what the administration's motivations were, but as I said the night before the plan's release, peace between Israel and the Palestinians is bigger than any election, whether in Israel or in the United States. And because I believe in my core that peace can and must be achieved to ensure the future of both Israelis and Palestinians and to further American interests, I listened with an open mind to President Trump's press conference. I was heartened to hear him talk about two states, a Jewish democratic state of Israel and a state of Palestine. I was glad to hear him talk about a return to negotiations. I felt hopeful, but that hope faded when I read the plan, which appears designed as an end point instead of a starting point for negotiations. I understand that this administration sought to do things differently, and I recognize, we all recognize, that past approaches haven't succeeded. But there is good reason that Republicans and Democrats have long supported certain core tenets of peace. We've done so because this is how we have furthered U.S. interests, support our allies, and provide stability in a volatile region. Even with the belief that this plan, as written, cannot succeed, I'm left struggling with the question of how we continue to preserve the possibility of two states. This is not an easy issue to grapple with. If we reject this plan out of hand, will facts on the ground move in a direction that simply makes two states impossible? If this plan seems to contemplate two states in name only, how does the U.S. restore its position as a mediator through which both sides can communicate? And how important is it for the United States to communicate that unilateral annexation by Israel will throw up a roadblock to negotiations that the White House says that it contemplates, and that refusal by the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table ensures that there is no chance of even discussing the idea of a two-state solution that the White House says it embraces in theory? How can we bring the international community back into the fold, as so many have been left in the dark on the plan's details? This is not easy. It's emotional. It is subjective. But I won't allow the belief that peace is out of reach. And I refuse to subscribe to the narrow view that you can either support Israel or you can support the Palestinians. You can do both. I do. I think most of us here do. Today, we have 3 former U.S. government officials who worked on the peace process in the George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and first and second term of Obama presidencies. Context is critical. The conflict has a deep and painful history on both sides. Walking away from internationally held consensus positions or rolling back existing commitments is just as dangerous as perpetuating the status quo. So it is my hope that our witnesses today can help us use the lessons of the past to inform the future. This is not easy, but with these witnesses, I am confident that we will leave here in with a better understanding of how we might go forward than we arrived with today. And with that, I turn to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for calling this very important and timely hearing. As the Chairman mentioned, late last month, President Donald Trump successfully unveiled his Peace to Prosperity plan, a vision to improve the lives of both the Palestinian and Israeli people. I believe this marks an historic opportunity that must be seized upon by both Israelis and Palestinians alike as a basis for the resumption of direct peace negotiations. I appreciate the extraordinary service of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for the people of Israel. We must send a direct message to negotiators on both sides, strongly encouraging a return to the negotiating table. This new plan is impressive. It's the most detailed Middle East peace plan ever proposed, but it is not the only text for a peace agreement. The Trump administration has expressly emphasized that this vision should provide the basis for the resumption of direct negotiations. It goes without saying that the specific outcomes of any negotiations will ultimately be to the Israelis and Palestinians. That being said, there's no doubt the President's vision is a major breakthrough in the history of the peace process. For the first time ever, we're seeing some daylight between the Palestinian intransigence and the practical concerns of the wider Arab world, with support by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain. We must seize upon these astounding signs of change as an opportunity to make progress toward a peace agreement like never before. Regarding the details of the plan, I believe that instead of defensively rejecting anything this President presents, we should carefully and thoughtfully review his plan. Say what you will, both Democrats and Republicans have tried to resolve this conflict, and it hasn't worked. I give the President credit, and specifically to Senior White House Advisor Jared Kushner, for working diligently on this plan for the entire term. Any criticism brought up here today, we've heard before, but I believe that it's a remarkable achievement and a breakthrough for peace. This plan offers a creative new way toward both the Israelis and Palestinians that is grounded more in the reality of the here and now as opposed to the dreams of yesterday. Ask any Israeli or Palestinian today, and they will tell you that they grew up with hopes and dreams of what peace could one day bring to their lives. Maybe it's time to end this conflict now once and for all. This plan will guarantee Israeli security concerns, ensure a sovereign and contiguous Palestinian state, and even provide a pathway to prosperity for the Palestinian people. President Trump's courageous vision aims to achieve mutual recognition of the State of Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people and the future state of Palestine as the nation-state of the Palestinian people. Both sides should hold fast to that as the basis of the resumption of talks. I am sure we will hear much today about the merits and flaws of specific details of the plan. It's important that we have conversation, but we must not forget that this is a bold new approach to the intractable conflict that has been raging for over 70 years. It has already yielded surprising regional responses that analysts would never have predicted. I would have hoped that President Trump and his team can, at the very least, jumpstart the peace process with this new vision. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and with that, I yield back to Chairman Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. I'll now recognize members of the subcommittee for a one-minute opening statement, should they choose to make one. And Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. While I don't agree with many policies of the current administration, I have to be honest that I was hoping that maybe the unconventional methods of President Trump would find a breakthrough in the process that could end the stalemate that has existed in recent years. Anyone who wants to offer a solution that can lead to a sustainable peace with dignity and statehood for both Israel and the Palestinians will have my ear. Sadly, that would not be. This plan was developed without input from one party, the Palestinians, and rejected within minutes of being announced. Unfortunately, I believe that what the administration presented was not a true offering of a peace plan, but a political ploy to appeal to hardliners both here in the United States and in Israel. Now, there have been many who have failed to achieve peace beforehand, and I don't think we should fault anyone for trying and failing to do so again. But what concerns me is that this plan has not only set back the prospects for peace, but has paved the path for damaging unilateral action by the Israelis, has undermined America's ability to lead future efforts, and may have in fact made a real peace more difficult to achieve. I hope I'm wrong. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. I will introduce our witnesses after reminding members that they'll have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation of the rules. Mr. Frank Lowenstein is an executive director in APCO's Washington office and head of the firm's global solutions practice. Prior to joining APCO, Mr. Lowenstein served as special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for the United States Department of State during the second term of the Obama administration. During his time with the department, Mr. Lowenstein also served as a senior advisor to Secretary of State John Kerry. Mr. Lowenstein previously served as staff director and chief counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Ms. Mara Rudman is the executive vice president for policy at the Center for American Progress. She served as deputy assistant to the president for national security affairs at the end of the Clinton administration and during the transition to the Obama administration, as well as deputy envoy and chief of staff for the Office of Special Envoy for Middle East Peace at the State Department during the first term of the Obama administration. Mr. Michael Singh is a senior fellow and managing director at the Washington Institute and a former senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. During his tenure at the White House during the Bush administration, from 2005 to 2008, Mr. Singh was responsible for devising and coordinating U.S. national security policy toward the Middle East and North Africa, with an emphasis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, among other issues. Previously, Mr. Singh served as special assistant to Secretaries of State Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, and at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. Thanks to all of you for being here today. Let me remind the witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared and written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Thank you so much for being here today, and Mr. Lowenstein, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing on the Middle East peace process. It's an important time for this discussion, and I'm honored to be here. I joined the State Department in early 2013, and I served as Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from July 4, 2014 until January 2017. I will draw on this experience to hopefully provide some context on the Trump administration's vision and how our approach differed from theirs. The main principle guiding the Obama-Kerry peacemaking efforts was that the Israelis and Palestinians could only resolve their differences through direct negotiations. Like our predecessors in prior administrations, we did not believe that a solution could be imposed on either side, and we strongly opposed any unilateral steps that prejudged the outcome of negotiations. We worked intensively with the Israelis and Palestinians to facilitate a return to negotiations, which took place from September 2013 until April 2014. When those talks ended, we focused on preserving the possibility of a two-state solution, including proposing mutual steps on the ground and final status principles that could provide a basis for the eventual resumption of talks. These principles, announced by Secretary Kerry in December of 2016, were informed by extensive conversations with the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves, as well as consultations with key regional and international leaders. This was reflected in their consensus endorsement at the Middle East Peace Conference in Paris in January 2017, which was the first time the international community, including key Arab and European countries, had accepted recognition of Israel as a Jewish state as part of the final agreement. The full text of these principles are attached, and I would be glad to answer any specific questions. For now, I would just note a few key points that highlight the difference in our approaches. First, our principles were very broad in order to allow the parties themselves to negotiate the details. On borders, Jerusalem, security, and refugees, they included elements that neither side liked. The goal was to create a baseline that would ensure the parties that their basic needs could be met through negotiations without saying how. The Trump administration's vision obviously went into much more detail, essentially to deciding the specifics of each issue on Israel's behalf. It leaves very little for the parties to actually negotiate and gives the Palestinians no reason to believe that their most basic aspirations would be met. While it is framed as a realistic two-state solution, the Palestinian quote-unquote state it envisions does not meet any reasonable definition of a sovereign nation. It is more of a blueprint for creating one state on Israel's terms. In fact, the Palestinians would not get anything at all until they have disarmed Hamas in Gaza, which is impossible when they are demilitarized. To those who argue that the Palestinians should accept this as a basis for the resumption of negotiations, I would ask, would Israel enter into talks based on a plan that the Palestinians wrote with the Arab League without ever even consulting them? Obviously not. But I don't think the main goal of the vision is actually to facilitate negotiations. It's to move the goalposts permanently in Israel's direction, and most importantly, to provide a pretext to unilaterally annex significant portions of the West Bank. This may very well have been the basic understanding between the Israelis and the Trump team. Israel would agree to a map with some hypothetical future territorial concessions in return for annexation now, which would of course help Prime Minister Netanyahu politically. That's the most damaging part of the Trump vision, not what it says, but what it does, by sanctioning unprecedented steps that will entrench an irreversible one-state reality. This is the culmination of decades of effort by the settler movement to create facts on the ground that would become a fait accompli. 27 years after the Oslo Accords, the transition to greater Palestinian control agreed to by the parties has essentially been reversed. The 60% of the West Bank known as Area C, much of which was supposed to be transferred to the Palestinians subject to negotiations on settlements and security, has effectively been given to the settlers. This process has accelerated dramatically during the Trump administration. In the 18 months since President Trump took office, settlement approvals tripled compared to the last 18 months of the Obama administration. Since 2017, 25 new illegal settlement outposts have been created, nearly double the amount from the entire previous decade. As part of this effort, the Trump administration has been working to redefine peace as the status quo, eroding basic concepts like state and sovereignty, defining refugees nearly out of existence, and eliminating terms like settlement, occupation, and West Bank altogether. They have recognized the unilateral annexation of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights without asking anything in return, and they've tried to pressure the Palestinians by cutting off all U.S. assistance, which has only increased stress on everyday Palestinians. The result has been a loss of hope among Palestinians, as President Abbas described yesterday. Palestinian support for the two-state solution is lower than ever. As one Palestinian leader said, there is no political horizon for improvement, and this is creating extreme anger within the public. In fact, Israeli security officials have recently warned of the risk of widespread unrest in the West Bank, and we may be seeing the beginning of that now in Ramallah. This could feed a cycle of turmoil, protests, and violence that would be very destabilizing, and could even lead to the eventual collapse of the Palestinian Authority. Under Obama, we took steps to prevent that type of breakdown and at least preserve the possibility of a two-state solution. We objected to unilateral steps by either side, including settlements and Palestinian actions at the International Criminal Court, and we strongly opposed incitement and boycotts. We gave Israel the largest military assistance package ever, worked to bolster the Palestinian economy, and solicited support for UNRWA relief efforts in Gaza. And we issued a report with the Middle East Peace Quartet, which is attached, calling for mutual concrete steps to begin the process of separating and creating a two-state reality on the ground. The Trump approach has done the opposite, betting that maximum pressure will push the Palestinians enough to cave in without actually collapsing. As Jared Kushner said, our goal can't be to keep things stable. Sometimes you have to strategically risk breaking things to get there. All sides should be prepared to take risks for peace, but it is hard to see the rewards here. If they are successful in implementing the vision, it would simply create an untenable, one-state reality of endless occupation and conflict. In a worst-case scenario, they are inviting instability or worse. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenstein. Ms. Redmond, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, committee members, it is an honor to appear before you. For me, this is truly a coming home. As I started my career working on these issues.
Ms. Redmond, can you just pull the mic a little closer to your mouth?
Thanks. As
Thank
I
you.
started my career working on these issues as a staffer for this committee, and particularly Congressman Keating, I started even before that working for my hometown congressman, one of your predecessors. So it really is wonderful for me to be able to be back here. I would like to offer a special note of appreciation in that context to former Chair Lee Hamilton, Howard Berman, and Ranking Member Sam Gadenson and their counterparts, because I feel like I was lucky enough to learn from the best on these issues. While I appreciate being here, I'm saddened to offer a stark conclusion up front, that the approach outlined by President Trump last month will help to solidify a one-state reality. This plan limits United States opportunities to help construct viable regional economic and security structures. It further dims the political horizon for a sustainable two-state solution that prior American presidents have so firmly held as serving United States interests, those of the parties, the region, and the world. I hope we can spend some time discussing the 4 key lessons that I wish this administration had recognized from the best efforts of its predecessors. they might yet provide a foundation for a way forward that better serves America and our friends and our allies. First, geopolitical context and local politics matter. Regional threats, leaders, and their abilities may shift with time and with place, but reaching sustainable resolution between the parties remains a necessary condition for a lasting regional economic and security architecture, which is critical for the United States as well as for the region. And Tip O'Neill had it right. All politics is local. The United States serves its own interests best when we find ways to reduce and mitigate the very real political risks that these leaders, Palestinian and Israeli leaders, must take to be able to resolve this conflict. Two, America leads best by keeping eyes on the horizon and laying pathways for reaching it. And I get that elements of this plan appear to do that. However, we know that these players, and players typically in these conflicts, are mired in the immediate and the fractious, and need help sometimes in being able to see to the edges. But I think some of the best examples of that, whether or not they ultimately led to the ultimately successful outcome, and I'm happy to talk about them in more detail as we go further, are what President George H.W. Bush did with the Madrid Conference in 1991, which helped to lead to some of the Oslo discussions, the role that President Clinton played at various points during his administration, leading to the ultimately unsuccessful Camp David talks, and what President George W. Bush did with Annapolis. I'm sure my colleague has things to offer on that. Third lesson, progress is most likely when the parties engage directly with one another. Outsiders' attempts to impose solutions generally are counterproductive. Examples that I would point to, President Anwar Sadat going to Jerusalem in 1977, leading to the successful Camp David agreements. The Oslo talks, the direct discussions between Palestinians and Israelis that led us through the 1990s, initiated directly with them, and then they brought in the United States. Less known, Middle East Desalinization Regional Commission, which has been ongoing talks, ongoing work on some of the most critical water issues throughout the Middle East, based out of Oman. Israel participates regularly and has been ongoing since the early 1990s. And the institution building work that Prime Minister Fayyad led, engineered, tremendous amount of work between Israelis and Palestinians for an extended period of time. Fourth lesson, U.S. aid is an important tool used effectively. Efforts to deploy it coercively are likely to backfire. When used effectively, and again, I'd point to Prime Minister Fayyad's institution building work in that regard that crossed two administrations, President Bush's and President Obama's, it gives us opportunities for transparency, accountability, and reform. It gives us leverage, network, and relationships. Another example, a positive example in that regard, is the security coordination work that the United States has done that is ended or very close to ending because of our coercive efforts with aid and how we've been working it. And I would say that threats to withhold U.S. aid or cut it off more likely cost the United States far more than they cost the recipient. They do not work. So again, those are the four lessons I have taken from more decades on this turf than I might care to acknowledge in public. But I very much hope that we have the opportunity to discuss them further. I welcome your questions, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thanks so much, Ms. Rudman. Mr. Singh, you're recognized.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to appear before you to talk about this important topic. I want to briefly cover the U.S. role in the peace process and what we can do going forward. You know, we've become so accustomed to an intensive U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we don't really stop any longer to ask what's at stake for us. But I think we should. That's, I think, where a good policy starts. Historically, I'd argue that the strategic foundation of our involvement in this issue has been twofold. First, the peace process was a mechanism to reconcile otherwise contradictory U.S. partnerships with Israel and the Arab states. And this motivation remained powerful well into the George W. Bush administration, in which I served. So, for example, President Bush first committed to Palestinian statehood in order to stave off a crisis in U.S.-Saudi relations in 2001. Second, the peace process provided a means of ensuring Israel's security, long considered a core U.S. interest in the region, by offering essentially the Palestinians a peaceful path to achieving their national aims and by strengthening those Palestinians who are committed to nonviolence. Both of these strategic foundations, I'd argue, have somewhat faded, have somewhat deteriorated. We no longer need any device to bring Israel and the Arab states together. They've already grown closer together over the past 2 decades due to common threats like Iran or jihadist terrorism, and frankly, due to their common concern about U.S. disengagement from the region. Israelis, after their bitter experiences with southern Lebanon, with Gaza disengagement, with the Second Intifada, are no longer convinced, I think, that making territorial concessions will yield security. This perception has been strengthened by the fact that Israelis have enjoyed more than a decade of relative quiet and prosperity despite the lack of progress towards peace. As for the Palestinians, while they're certainly not comfortable with the status quo, they appear to share Israelis' pessimism regarding a two-state solution as the alternative to it. If we want to forge a peace deal, nevertheless, these dynamics would need to change. In any negotiation, a deal only succeeds if both parties perceive it as better for their interests than the alternatives. Preliminary talks can help identify if such a range of deals exists, but negotiations can only really proceed in earnest once such a zone of possible agreement has been identified. If no such zone exists, that is, if there's no overlap between what each party finds minimally acceptable, the only thing we can really do is wait for circumstances to change or to try to change the circumstances ourselves. To do the latter, we'd either need to sweeten the deal or make the alternatives worse. And over the years, various administrations have tried to do both, tried to come up with creative proposals to satisfy both sides' interests, and also tried to worsen the alternatives. We've penalized and browbeaten both sides, and we've offered both sides inducements. When we embark on this process, though, we need to bear in mind 3 things. First, we're never going to convince either party that we understand their interests better than they do. We've tried and it's never worked. Second, neither side is a monolith. The interests of the Palestinian leadership don't necessarily match the interests of the Palestinian people. And frankly, President Abbas has to also worry about groups like Hamas, perhaps more than he sometimes worries about a peace deal. And in Israel, as all of you know, small political parties have outsized influence due to the coalition politics. Third, we should never pursue a deal for a deal's sake. When offering inducements or disincentives, we can't lose sight of our own interests, lest we cut off our nose to spite our face. This, for example, is why I would not place conditions on Israeli military aid for the sake of the peace process, since the clearest U.S. interest at stake is Israel's security. So where do we go from here? Just briefly. I'm sure that we're going to delve into the details of the plan in the Q&A, and I'm happy to share lessons from the Annapolis process, from the roadmap, from those episodes that I participated in, and from the days of the Intifada. Suffice to say, this plan has been welcomed by Israel and greeted with apprehension by the Palestinians, and others' reactions have been more muted, I would say. I'd recommend that the U.S. do 2 things and avoid doing 3 others as we go forward. There's always more to avoid than to do. First, in terms of things we should do, the Trump administration should continue to stress that this is an opening position, subject to negotiation. The Palestinians, rather than rejecting it outright, can hopefully thus be persuaded to counter it, to come forward with their own ideas. Second, the administration should now seek, I think, to multilateralize what has been a closely held U.S.-Israel process, perhaps by seeking the endorsement of the Quartet, not necessarily for the plan's particulars, but for its seriousness and for the need to negotiate directly between the parties. In terms of what not to do, first, I don't think the U.S. should encourage Israel to annex new territories. The risk in doing so is that this might push Palestinians to regard, essentially, a negotiated peace as no longer viable, and instead push them towards those alternatives we've been trying to get them away from, whether that's violence or whether that's seeking a binational state, both of which would threaten Israel. Second, I don't think we should use aid to the Palestinians as leverage for this plan, or for any plan, frankly. U.S. security and economic assistance are useful to us in their own right. They've been instrumental in maintaining stability in the West Bank and links between Israelis and Palestinians. And this ensures not only Israel's security, not only the security, frankly, of the Palestinians, but that a foundation exists for a future peace if none can be achieved now. And then finally, I don't think we should allow the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to take center stage in our or our regional partners' relations with Israel. We should see Israel instead through the lens of a partnership to counter mutual threats like Iran and like terrorism, and an especially valuable one, frankly, as we look to diminish or decrease our own footprint in the region. The bottom line, Congressman, is that our attention to the peace process has tended over multiple administrations to waver, frankly, as the strategic impetus for U.S. focus on this issue has faded, and because no progress, frankly, is possible until the parties themselves decide that a negotiated peace trumps the alternatives. We should do what we can to encourage negotiations, preserve the possibility for future talks, but we need to keep our eye, I think, on the bigger regional and geopolitical picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singh. Thanks to all of the witnesses. We will now move to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I will defer until later, so we'll start with the Ranking Member Wilson, and then we will alternate between the parties. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, and thank each of you for your service on behalf of our country with different administrations and different points of view, but we appreciate the service of each of you. Mr. Singh, how has the security coordination between the Israelis and Palestinians helped to stabilize Israel and the West Bank? What role does the United States play in facilitating this coordination?
The security coordination, I would argue, has been tremendously important. You have to remember that during the days of the Intifada, there were something like 50 to 60,000 people on the payrolls of the various PA or Palestinian security organs. There was a very conscious effort then in the middle of the 2000s to try to professionalize those security forces under the U.S. security coordinator that was created, first General Ward, then General Dayton, and many others have followed after that. Those professional security forces, the PA security forces, proved able to work with the IDF and with other Israeli security organs to really prevent the West Bank, frankly, from turning into Gaza, to keep law and order in the West Bank in a way that benefited both Israelis and Palestinians. The U.S. has played a tremendously important role in that. We played the key facilitating role in that, and obviously our security assistance has been essential to that.
And next, during your service in government, the United States has funded the people-to-people reconciliation programs between the Israelis and Palestinians. What is your assessment of the impact of these programs?
I think the people-to-people programs are tremendously important. This is the kind of long-term program where you don't see the benefits right away, and oftentimes those are things which get sort of pushed to the side in sort of in our foreign policy where everything is urgent in a sense. But I do think that ultimately those people-to-people exchanges are key to kind of breaking down barriers between the Israeli and Palestinian populations, especially since now there's far less interaction between those populations than there was in the past. And so maintaining those programs is vital.
And the administration's peace plan has a considerable focus on improving the Palestinian economy. Do you believe that improving the economy can pave the way toward a political resolution?
I think it's an interactive, sort of iterative process. I think improving the economy, building economic institutions, building a better life for Palestinians is vital for laying that foundation for peace. At the same time, we need to recognize that economic growth and prosperity is also dependent on having a sort of secure environment, on having a sort of certain political foundation of support for that institution building, and that's often where, frankly, this is tripped up in the past, where we had, for example, Prime Minister Fayyad, who Ms. Rudman mentioned, leading the institution-building efforts, but lacking maybe the political support from the higher-level leadership of the Palestinians. So there's an interaction between the two, but certainly, without economic prosperity and growth, you're not going to have a viable Palestinian state.
And what path do you see toward the disarmament of Hamas, the terrorist group that currently rules the Palestinian Strip?
I think it's a tremendously difficult issue. I mean, Hamas in Gaza is very strong. Obviously, Israel has fought multiple conflicts with Hamas and to some extent with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other groups which are present there in Gaza. And Hamas has shown, frankly, very little inclination to disarm or to yield authority in the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority. I think we've made efforts to sort of calm the situation there, to try to prevent it from blowing up into another war, and that's important. But so far we haven't made much headway, neither has the PA, in disarming Hamas or in removing them from the Gaza Strip.
And in the past, what has caused the peace process to break down?
Well, so many things. Look, when I was working on this issue during the George W. Bush administration, we were dealing with the aftermath of the breakdown in the peace process, because you went from the Camp David talks, Taba talks of 2000, to the Intifada, which we felt was essentially planned and ordered by Chairman Arafat of the PLO. And there was an effort to stop that violence and work our way back to a more productive space. But our focus was not on the peace process. Our focus was not on a negotiation. Our focus under President Bush, who I think wanted to view this issue differently and treat it differently, was on ending terrorism, and especially the support for terrorism coming from official Palestinian bodies, and to focus on reforms so that a future Palestinian state, which he was committed to, would be a democratic state, would be a viable state. I think ultimately that peace process broke down not because of disagreement over that concept, but more because of, number one, problems within the Palestinian sphere. You had Hamas win elections in 2006, take over Gaza in 2007, and then, frankly, impatience on our part. We abandoned that approach of putting terrorism, putting security, I should say, and putting reform first, and we moved straight to final status negotiations.
And thank each of you, and my time is up, but we, again, appreciate the service of each of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lowenstein, in your opinion, what was the intended purpose of the Trump plan? And, was it being put forward in the hopes that it would actually move the ball in a productive way? And whatever, regardless of what you think the intention was, do you think that ultimately, what do you think ultimately will be its impact on the peace process and the prospects for peace?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as I said in my testimony, I don't think the purpose of this was to get the parties back to negotiations. I think they had to know that there was no way on earth the Palestinians were ever going to resume negotiations on this basis, nor was there any reasonable hope that our Gulf friends and allies would pressure the Palestinians to do that. I think, as I said, that the purpose was really to provide, in the first instance, a pretext for Israel to annex significant portions of the West Bank, and secondly, to move the goalposts significantly in the direction of Israel in terms of what their desires were in a final peace agreement. And I would add that having negotiated with the Israelis really for countless hours, including on a much longer framework document than the one that we wound up putting out publicly, a lot of this stuff comes right from them. Honestly, I think they could virtually have written this thing themselves. So you got to understand going in that the objective there is to move the goalposts in their direction, and then really I think the stuff on the ground is what their primary intention was.
And what do you see today as the principal stumbling blocks to beginning this peace process in an authentic way?
Candidly, sir, I think the problem is that there's no willingness on either side right now to make the kind of incredibly difficult compromises that would be required to advance a real peace process. I think, therefore, the notion of sitting down and having direct talks is a little facile. Honestly, we talked about that. We tried it. I know in the first Obama term, they actually got the parties to talk briefly. And if those conversations are just going to end badly, then you really have achieved very little in doing so. So I don't think that the parties are anywhere near the type of mindset, either at the leadership level or in terms of support for the public, to make the kind of compromises that are necessary.
Ms. Rudman, the last page of the report says, while the vision is ambitious, it is achievable. The future of the Palestinians is one of huge promise and potential. The Palestinian story does not end here. Their story is just being written. But of course, apparently it's being written without them. And so, I'm wondering do you see any benefit in the long run to the administration putting forward such a one-sided and unachievable plan? And if there is no benefit, what might be the negative or unintended consequences? And then the last part of the question is, I think maybe it was Mr. Singh made the suggestion, maybe what the Palestinians should do is put together their own plan, since this is essentially the Israeli plan, as Mr. Lowenstein just mentioned. Maybe they should just release a peace plan that's totally their view of it, and maybe those two are the ends of the beginning, or would that not be productive? So it's a kind of three-part question.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me start with the last part of your question and maybe work my way backwards. I think the Palestinians, it might be one starting point for them to put out their plan. It might lead to the same question you started with, where would that get us? I would say in some senses the broad Palestinian starting place would probably be the Saudi initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, which is not a detailed plan, but a scoping framework in terms of what might represent the Palestinian perspective at this point. In terms of what the intended purpose was, I am the last person that should be speaking to others, to the intentions of this administration on that.
The question was actually about the unintended consequences.
And for the unintended consequences, that I can speak to. Because as I said, I think that my biggest concern about it is that it locks in or gets much closer to locking in a one-state reality, which I honestly believe that neither the Palestinian leadership nor the Israeli leadership truly wants. I think that may well be an unintended consequence. I like to believe in the best motives of all involved, but I fear that is an unintended consequence. I would like to say that I think that the do's and don'ts that Mr. Singh outlined would be, looking at those would be ways of trying to step back from those unintended consequences. But I fear that if we look at the worst of what can happen from that plan being out there, it is that.
Can I just ask quickly what you think the impact of the plan would, or possible annexation would be on Jordan, on the peace treaty with Israel, the Palestinians that make up a majority of the population, and what the implications of that might be?
Thank you. So in terms of the consequences for Jordan, which go to me directly to why U.S. interests are so imperiled ultimately by this plan, because our primary interest or focus is ourselves and our security interests in the region. And the probably biggest threat in this plan is how imperiled Jordan is. And it's not a surprise that Jordan, given their strong relationship with the United States, was still the first country to very quickly put out a statement expressing strong concern with the plan. Jordan has the longest border with Israel. Jordan has a 25-year-plus peace agreement with Israel that is under some tension now. Not only annexation, but even the threat to annex the Jordan Valley destabilizes the king, King Abdullah, who is a good friend of ours, tries to be a friend to Israel, and ultimately Israel needs Jordan to be secure and needs the king to be secure. So this is not good for Israel, it's not good for Jordan, it's not good for us. And we should have the vision to be able to see that.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cellini. Mr. Mast, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank you all for your testimony. I don't agree with everything that was said, but I enjoyed the analysis that you each offered, so I thank you certainly for that. I want to focus my questioning on a Palestinian state of mind. And Mr. Lowenstein, I think you summed it up very well, briefly, just by saying you believe that the support for a two-state solution among Palestinians is, to quote you, lower than ever. I think that's exactly what you said. And I think you all mentioned in some form or another that support for two-state solution among Palestinians is at a low point in some way that you mentioned it. So I wanted to ask a broad question. What is it that you think is the percentage of Palestinians that don't want to see a two-state solution, some sort of metric, or would rather see, if they're not looking for a two-state solution, want to see a one-state solution, one state being simply a state of Palestine and no state of Israel?
Sir, I'll start on that one. There was actually just a poll released yesterday by Khalil Shikaki, who is sort of the preeminent Palestinian pollster. I've got a copy of it here if you're interested in taking a look. But yeah, the support for the two-state solution is at 40% among the Palestinian people right now. That's the lowest level since Oslo was announced. I think those numbers will vary depending on how the Palestinians view the viability of a two-state solution. In other words, if they are of the view that it's completely unrealistic, then far fewer of them will express support for it when they're asked in a poll. And I think in this instance, what the Trump administration plan has done, but really it's much more than the vision. It's the last 3 years of policies on the ground. I think they've just about destroyed any hope that the Palestinian people had that a two-state solution is possible. And I would just say
what
that—
percent do you believe want one state of Palestine?
It varies from poll to poll. You'll find some who are in favor of violent resistance, unfortunately, and sadly those numbers go up.
What are some of those varying numbers in poll to poll?
Well, I can give you the poll if you'd like. I've got it all right in front of me.
I'll look forward to seeing it. I'd love if you'd discuss it for a minute. so we can all benefit.
Sure, yeah,
from
I
the
think
information.
well, without getting into the specific numbers here, I think that the main point to understand is that the Palestinians have agency in this process as well.
No, can you give me the specific numbers? That's what I'm looking for.
Oh, sure, you want to actually?
I want facts. That's.
Yeah, well, 94% of Palestinians are opposed to the Trump plan. 69% support ending the implementation of Oslo altogether, right? And 76% are opposed to resuming negotiations with Israel, in large part because they have no faith in the two-state solution. And if I could just very briefly touch on that, the 69% of the public that supports ending the implementation of Oslo, that's a very significant figure that folks ought to bear in mind, because if the Palestinian Authority were to collapse, and I'm not saying that it will, the Palestinians have threatened that often and they've never followed through on it. I think it would take an implosion internally as a result of economic and other factors rather than a decision made by the leadership. But if that were to be the case, it would shift an enormous amount of the military, administrative and financial burden of the occupation onto the Israelis. The most concerned I ever saw the Israelis in 4 years of negotiating with them was the first time the Palestinians said, we're done, we're throwing the keys over the fence, meaning that we're going to disband the Palestinian Authority and let Israel take care of all of this. I talked to the Israeli negotiators soon after that, and the way they described it was like a game of Russian roulette, that they didn't think the Palestinians would actually follow through, but if they did, it was going to be disastrous for Israel, because there really is no good plan for how to administer 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank in the absence of the Palestinians.
Those are some good numbers. I think those are vitally important. I wish you would have given them in your opening speech. I think that's important for all of us to take into consideration as we view what's going on here. I didn't hear, I don't know if you have a number for it, how many support one state of Palestine?
If you'll allow me 1 second, sir, I think I can find that.
Yeah, please, by all means. I'll just pontificate for a few minutes as you're finding that. I think it's interesting that we do have members of Congress now that are supporting, in fact, a one-state solution for just those within Palestine, want to see Israel wiped off the map. But I want to ask another question because I think you gave outstanding numbers. And this is more of an opinion question, Mr. Singh and Ms. Rudman. Would any of you personally, would you personally work to build a better life for somebody that's shooting at you?
No.
Yes.
I'm going to stick with the poll numbers.
You're wise to do so.
Of course, the objective would be to get them to stop shooting at you, and then whatever means was most effective to achieve that end result. But in any event, as for the Palestinian people, according to this poll, 85% support waging a diplomatic struggle, 84% support withdrawing Palestinian recognition of Israel, 78% support waging.
And I'll give you your time back, Chairman. Did you say 80? I just want to hear it correctly. Did you say 84? Or did you say 48? Reject the state of Israel.
Oh, no, not reject the state of Israel. It's waging the struggle for Palestinian statehood through international organizations. That's what they think that the Palestinian Authority is going to continue doing. But 84% support, as I said, withdrawing Palestinian recognition of Israel. 78% support waging nonviolent popular demonstrations. And 69% support ending security coordination altogether. So in any event, the point there, the top line point is that there's an enormous amount of frustration building among the Palestinians, and that in and of itself poses, I think, a risk to U.S. interests in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the added time. I think that's one of the most important numbers I've ever heard, 84% rejecting the withdrawal of recognition of Israel. That's an important number to focus on. Thank you,
Mr. Mass. Mr. Keating, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Rudman mentioned Jordan and the importance of Jordan to Israel and to the U.S. And I want to just ask the other two witnesses their view of Jordan, how important that role is, how it's being shaped, and what the possibilities going forward will be with Jordan's role. So, Mr. Lowenstein, you're still working on your notes, I know, but this is one you don't have to look up. I'm over here. There you go. Hello. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we should be very concerned about what's going to happen in Jordan. We spent a lot of time with the Jordanians during the 4 years I was serving the Obama administration, and that country is in a precarious position. They have an enormous number of refugees, obviously of Palestinian descent. They also took on an enormous number of Syrian refugees. So I think something around half of that country right now is refugees. Don't quote me on that specific number, but it puts an enormous amount of pressure on the king. They are also in a difficult situation with respect to their relationship with Israel. Obviously, they share a very close relationship on a number of different levels with the Israelis, not including the peace process, by the way, where they were always willing to draw a line in terms of their views versus the Israelis' views. But it's a very delicate balance, and there's a lot of popular resentment towards Israel in Jordan right now. And the king is in a situation where he's trying to please both the United States and a restive population on these kind of issues. And as I think some of my colleagues have suggested, it's risky to tip that balance any further over.
Mr. Singh?
Yeah, I would just, I guess, agree that Jordan-Israel relations are at a low ebb, I think, unfortunately. I think the relationship with Jordan is vital for both the United States and for Israel when you look at the array of security concerns we have in the region. And our support for Jordan and the friendship with Jordan, I think, is just tremendously important for us to maintain. I think that there were some concerns before the plan was released that it would not reflect the special role that Jordan has had in some of the issues at hand here. I do think some care was put into the plan to ensure that that wasn't the case. But it is something I think that we do need to remain vigilant about, that we not undermine Jordan's role, historic role in some of these issues, that we not undermine Jordan's position in the region and so forth.
Great. Mr. Singh had really capsulized things into the do's going forward and the don'ts going forward. I'd like to ask our other two witnesses about that, and also ask them, really, since there seems to be consensus with the witnesses that the potential for this plan is nil, pretty fair statement, as it's constituted right now. So do the do's and the don'ts that Mr. Singh had framed this within, and also, if you could, what's your worst fear going forward for the United States as you see it?
So my worst fear for the United States is that...
I mean, let me qualify that, absent the plan, just generally, as we sit and speak of this right now.
Absent the plan because the plan is out there, though, you're saying, just to understand your question.
Yeah, it's just generally speaking, but also going forward.
Right. So my concern is that moves towards annexation continue. Jordan is destabilized. Israel faces very difficult decisions that continuing of the status quo forces upon them, which I think when you're in the status quo, you think things can continue as they are forever, but the security situation in the West Bank deteriorates, the security situation in Jordan deteriorates. Israelis are confronted with their own one-state reality, Congressman, and so there's polling there as well that is very concerning about the choices that Israelis would make. And for the United States, we are faced with, again, a diversion of our resources when we have challenging issues elsewhere in the world, and we are focusing more...
Excuse me, Mr. Lowenstein, can you do something about 30 seconds to address that?
Yes, sir. My biggest concern, very simply, is the collapse of the Palestinian Authority and massive instability coming to Israel as a result of that, which we as the United States will be put in an incredibly difficult position to try to manage that.
Great. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Watkins, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. We disagree on some areas. I'm in full and complete support of the President and Mike Pompeo's leadership. I like the plan moving forward. But I want to talk a bit about Palestinian governance and violence. The last time Palestinians held legislative elections, Hamas, a terrorist group, emerged victorious. Does popular support for Hamas still exist among the Palestinian people? And if so, how can we shift that towards nonviolence? Mr. Singh?
I think there is still support for Hamas amongst Palestinians. I'm not familiar with the latest poll numbers, but it's pretty close, I think, between Hamas and Fatah, the the party of Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority. How can we shift them towards nonviolence is a tough question. Obviously, we've been trying to figure out ways to do that since the early 2000s with the quartet principles, for example, holding out conditions they needed to meet before we would engage with them, by putting pressure on them through sanctions, through efforts to interdict weapons flows, to stop the support they get from Iran. We have tried to strengthen peace-minded Palestinians to show that they had international support and Hamas didn't. But a lot of that didn't succeed. I think what we need, frankly, is we need leaders on the Palestinian side who do believe in peace to be courageous and to lead their people. I think ultimately it's going to have to come from them more than it comes from us.
I agree, sir. Would you like to add anything, Ms. Rudman or Mr. Lowenstein?
I would second what Mr. Singh has said, but I would also reinforce that, yes, we need leaders who are willing to do that. We've had some of those leaders. I think we could have done more to support them. I think that the Israeli side could have done more to support them. And I think it is in our interest, the United States' interest, to continue to look for ways to support those leaders, which is why U.S. assistance is so important, and thoughtfully provided U.S. assistance both on the economic and on the security side, and why it is so dangerous for the United States to remove that assistance from the equation.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly that the Palestinians have two different leaders. Obviously, they have Hamas in Gaza, and they have Fatah and the PLO in the West Bank. Interestingly, in the 2 months since the Palestinians were last polled, there's a 5% increase in support for Haniyeh and Hamas vice Abbas, primarily, we believe, as a result of the Trump administration vision and other efforts that they've made. In other words, when President Abbas seems feckless, when he seems unable to deliver, when his path, which really has been mostly embracing nonviolence, when that seems like it's not working, when it seems like it's just resulting in Israel continuing to change facts on the ground and a feeling of general helplessness, then sympathy for the other side grows. So I think one simple thing we can do is to provide Palestinians in the West Bank with a sense that continuing down the path with the PA and Abbas will lead them to a place where their national aspirations can be realized.
Thank you for your time. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Mr. Allred, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel for being here and for your service. When I went to Israel and have studied this issue, I get the impression that successive generations of Americans come over there and say, okay, now we've got the idea that's going to solve your issues. We're going to give you the plan, and we've been here 15 minutes, but we know what's best for you. And so I agree. I think all three of you in your testimony have laid out a vision in which the United States is a facilitator for discussions between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and that we are not setting the exact conditions because we can't, or any outside party can't. And so I am curious, you could briefly, as this is a large topic, narrow down what you think the most important conditions are that we can try and set so that those discussions can take place and be productive. And you can just go down. We can start with you, Mr. Lowenstein.
Thank you, Congressman. We put out a report along with the Middle East Quartet that set forth a series of steps that both sides could take on the ground, Palestinians addressing incitement and the Israelis stopping settlement activity and resuming the transition contemplated by Oslo. So what we were trying to do there was to give concrete recommendations for what each side could do to create the beginnings of a two-state reality on the ground, and also momentum towards a two-state solution that could give both sides hope that a negotiation might achieve the national aspirations of both sides.
Thank you. Ms. Rudman.
There are some specific steps that go to addressing the very real security concerns that both sides have. And security, and I address it some in my written testimony, means some of the same and some different things, but there are tangible things that both sides can be doing. That security coordination that has been ongoing is one aspect of that, coupled with economic measures that go directly to people who live there now and can benefit in real ways, and that is average people on the ground. basic assistance for schools and healthcare, as well as helping businesses. And again, that involves Israelis and Palestinians working together and showing that, linked to movement and access issues and other things that, again, help Israelis as well as Palestinians and tie to a vision for the future, not in isolation from that.
Absolutely. Interesting.
So I guess I can think of at least three categories of things that we can do. One of them, I think, is to be a facilitator in negotiations, should there be a desire on the part of the two parties. Mr. Keating said that there was a consensus that the chances for this plan were nil. I break from that consensus, I think, in the sense that I think what the administration is trying to do in part is to provoke that negotiation. Will it succeed? I don't know. But ultimately, if it does, if there is a negotiation, we can play a facilitating role, sometimes even by sort of stepping forward with some views on the positions. This is what President Bush did, for example, in 2004 with the Bush-Sharon letter, which was taken, a decision that was taken in the context of Gaza disengagement in an effort to help Prime Minister Sharon with that effort. But it really depends vitally on the two parties' desire to negotiate. And it may be that what we see, in fact, is something that looks more like unilateral Israeli disengagement and according with this plan rather than a negotiation. I think the second thing we can do is to, frankly, maintain the foundation for prosperity and security in these areas, even absent a negotiated peace. So the security assistance, the economic assistance, the people-to-people programs, all those things that we've been talking about so far. And the third, and I would argue maybe even the most vital, is countering kind of those spoiler forces that work actively against peace. I put Iran, frankly, at the top of that list. It's no secret that every time there's hope in the peace process, Iran will do what it can to try to work against that through funding Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and so forth. That was true in the 90s. It's just as true today. But it also is true of other groups who are working actively against the idea of peace because they want to put pressure on Israel or they want to put pressure on peace-minded Palestinians and so forth.
Yeah, I would associate myself with all of your comments. And Mr. Singh, you said something I wanted to follow up on. We've talked about Jordan, but what does a multilateral approach look like here to be successful?
Well, I agree with my colleagues here that ultimately the negotiations themselves really have to be between the two parties. What we found during the Bush administration was the most progress happened when the two parties sat down by themselves to talk. And when we tried to make it a trilateral discussion involving ourselves, that didn't help the dynamic, essentially. What I think we can do, though, as the United States, is we can bring international support to the process. So, for example, as I said, I think the next step for the Trump administration should be to go to a body like the Quartet and to seek, again, it might be difficult to get endorsement for the specifics of the plan, but to get an endorsement for the idea that this plan is maybe a starting point, that it's sort of something to be taken seriously, that we want to see negotiations proceed from this point. I think that's not unachievable.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. Mr. Zeldin, you're recognized.
Well, thank you to the chair and the ranking member for holding today's hearing. I want to thank the chair in his efforts to approach this entire conversation in the best of faith and a lot of genuine effort and wanting to be part of the solution. There is one thing that unites all of the members up here on the dais as well as our three witnesses. None of us have been successful at solving the Middle East peace problem over the course of our time talking about it. And I would wish only the best on anyone who wants to try, and I would love to be able to help. And I just wanted to point out something with regards to this plan that was recently introduced by the administration. Some criticized it as a photo op or a press release. And I know that the individuals, not in this room, but the individuals who have been involved as part of the administration spent years working on it, and a lot of meetings, a lot of conversations to collect a lot of ideas. This wasn't one page of a press release. It was dozens of pages and a map, and the most important part of it is an attitude and the open-mindedness, the message to be sent to the Palestinians, or anyone for that matter, who looks at the plan and says that there's a flaw. The attitude of the administration is, and no matter who the administration is at any time, should continue to be, if you have an idea, if you have a suggestion, if you have a proposal, offer it. If you have a way that you want to improve this text, let us know what your idea is. David Cicilline asked a really important question when he was here to Ms. Rudman. Should the Palestinians offer up their own plan if they don't agree with this? My answer to that would be absolutely. I think that would be fantastic for the Palestinians. They have options. They can use the text of what was recently introduced and say, these are the 5 or 40 things that we want changed that are important to us, or they can, if they so choose, throw it in the trash and say, this is what we want. And maybe that product will look very different than what this plan is that's before us that we're talking about. But that open-mindedness, that encouragement to the Palestinians is an important message. I would encourage this administration to continue to have that attitude, and whatever administration is to follow the current administration to keep that attitude. But I just wanted to answer that question, if I could, that Mr. Cicilline posed, that I do believe the Palestinians should offer a plan if they are rejecting this outright. But if any of the witnesses can comment to, Hamas has a lot of influence within the Palestinian Authority, amongst the Palestinian people. Can you speak to their principles as it relates to jihad as an obligation, or whether or not if a Palestinian negotiates with an Israeli or with the U.S. government that they're not a real Palestinian, or that there's a desire that Israel doesn't exist, or specifically doesn't exist as a Jewish state? Can you tell us a little bit about the principles of Hamas? We know they have influence, but allowing not just this committee, but for our country to better understand what we're up against on the other side of this negotiation.
Can I jump in just real quickly on that? And first of all, I would point out that yesterday President Abbas did go to the United Nations and offer to negotiate with Israel on the basis of prior UN resolutions. And effectively what he means by that is UN Resolution 242, which followed the 1967 war. And it basically just calls for Israel to withdraw, not from all of the territories it occupied in 1967, but the implication is most of them. The Palestinians accepted land swaps as a part of that. They have also said repeatedly, as one of my colleagues mentioned, that they embrace the Arab Peace Initiative, which calls for a Palestinian state of the 1967 lines and with a capital in East Jerusalem. So just as a matter of clarification, Abbas did do exactly that yesterday. He offered to resume negotiations with the Israelis on what have been commonly understood terms of reference for the conflict for the last 50 years or so. With respect to Hamas, it's bent on the destruction of Israel. It's a terrorist organization, and there's really no way you can work with them, obviously, unless they accept the Quartet conditions, which I'm not sure is ever going to be realistic. But I would make one minor distinction here, which is that they are not a big player in the PA at all. The Palestinian Authority is entirely separate. In fact, I think Mahmoud Abbas would view Hamas as his biggest enemy. And in a lot of ways, what's going on in Gaza now is a reflection not only of Israel's concern about the security situation there, but of Abbas's deep concern about Hamas, its potential influence in the West Bank and otherwise.
I appreciate that. We're at a time that really opens up what could be 10 more minutes of an exchange, but I'm going to have to yield back to the chair for a lack of time.
Thank you, Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to follow up on Mr. Zeldin's line of questioning. I think what it suggests is that you can put forward an imperfect plan, and it's not the end of the world, because, of course, as Mr. Singh suggested, that plan can be the starting point for further negotiations. As Mr. Zeldin suggested, the Palestinians could put forward a counter plan, the Arab states could put forward a counter plan, and somehow out of that process we can get to progress. But here's my question and concern. Since this plan envisions one-party Israel beginning annexation of land now, unilaterally, that Palestinians consider to be part of a future Palestinian state. Since the United States and Israel are apparently now meeting to discuss the contours of that annexation, which the United States will apparently bless, if that happens, what is there left to negotiate?
Well, Congressman, I do think annexation would carry a lot of risks. It wouldn't be the first time that this idea had come up. I mean, I think Prime Minister Olmert, Prime Minister Sharon, now more than 15 years ago, basically were of the mind that if they couldn't reach a negotiated solution with the Palestinians, they would withdraw past the security fence and then annex the blocks that were there. I do think that the way it's laid out in this plan, one wonders if the sort of the border they're envisioning would in fact be a secure border because of these isolated enclaves and so forth. So I think that the consequences of annexation would include some of the things we talked about before, Israel's relationship with Jordan, the future prospects for a peace negotiation, which is what you're alluding to. But I think Israel will also need to, and I think the United States will need to, since Israel's security is first and foremost, I think, in our mind in this process, need to think about the security implications for Israel as to where that line would be.
Anybody else want to take that on? I mean, it does seem to me that the primary issue on the table in all of these negotiations going back 20 years is land. It's what is the map of a future Palestinian state in a two-state scenario? And if Israel unilaterally decides that with our support and annexes the land that it believes it should have, then isn't that then a done deal, and what is there left to negotiate?
Yes, Congressman, but I would say it's a yes, but. So there are things left to negotiate. There is room. The reason that I believe it is a devastating move goes to the basic security issues for all involved. And so on a practical matter, so I believe that you could argue, as Mr. Singh is, that that there are ways of, going back to what he said earlier, there are ways that you could be open to this negotiation. You could look at the initial annexation moves as something that was part of, if you look at it as akin to the Olmert and Sharon time, it's a movement in progress. The challenge of that is that the way this plan is written and the ways that it has been started to be implemented even since January 28th is in itself so destabilizing that if you're on the Palestinian side, you have very little incentive to be looking for ways to figure out how to engage in a proactive way. And if you're, for the United States, we are looking at our security interests and Israel's security interest as well as Palestinian security interests, and the plan is not giving us a launching point for doing that. So it's not, to me, just about the land, though I take your point. It's about our interests and why this doesn't advance it. So I get the 30% amount of land in Jordan, the Jordan Valley, is a significant and startling figure. To me, it's not only that. It's all that's involved in getting there.
Hello, Congressman. Nice to see you again. I would point out just a couple things very quickly. First of all, in my experience, the most difficult issue was not territory. It was security and Jerusalem. Those were the two hardest issues if you're ever going to get to final status negotiations. I think the status quo right now serves Israel very well with respect to security, obviously with respect to Jerusalem, with respect to refugees. And I think their goal is really just to perpetuate the status quo and find a way to describe that as peace. And I think there's been a concerted effort on their part to do exactly that. I think the most damaging part of annexation is yes, that it would presuppose the outcome of negotiations on borders, but also it sends a message to the Israelis and to the Palestinians that Israel is going to keep on doing exactly what it wants to do, and there's really nothing anybody can do to stop them. And that is a very, I think, dangerous message for the Palestinians.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Vargas, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I apologize for my voice today. I have a sore throat, but I do again want to welcome the witnesses here. I'm a very strong supporter of Israel and very proudly support them. First time I went to Israel was 1993. I got to travel extensively around the country and remember going to the Golan Heights and being there with a number of generals, one of whom said that someday we are going to return this land. And I thought, wow, that's pretty stupid. You know, it seems like an area that you'll be always vulnerable for. Well, wow, what a difference 27 years makes. You know, no one is thinking about returning the Golan Heights to anybody. I mean, it would just be a really dumb idea. And I guess the reason I say that is that things change over time. And one of the things that I think is important is that Israel has to figure out what it needs, not only to survive, but to thrive. And it's going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And we as an ally, and hopefully we as a friendly group of legislators, certainly myself, are going to try to help Israel in that process. And Israel will have to make some difficult decisions. There's no doubt about it. So will the Palestinians. That's what it's going to be about. But they're going to have to make the decisions. We're not going to impose it upon them. They're going to have to make them. But again, time also seems to heal some problems. I've been able to travel extensively around the area. And one of the things I remember back in 1993, how angry some of the bordering countries were with Israel. Well, that has changed pretty dramatically now. In fact, it's interesting to go to a place like Egypt, where they talk of Israel almost as an ally now. I mean, it's fascinating to see how time has changed things. So I look at this process and say I don't think it's something that it's going to be actionable if the plan is put out there, but it's someone's attempt to do something. But the more important thing, I think, is that Israel has to figure these things out. And it has to have a partner that's willing to negotiate without these preconditions. And it hasn't had it so far. So I don't blame Israel at all in this process. I think it's been more than willing to talk and try to get to some solution, but it hasn't had a partner. Am I wrong in that? Mr. Singh?
No, Congressman, I think that's, for the most part, right. I mean, when, again, if we're looking at the history of this, when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, the Palestinians objected to that. When Prime Minister Olmert came forward with a plan that would have given the Palestinians something like 93%, 94% of the West Bank, plus swaps that would have made it almost 100%, the Palestinians didn't respond to the plan. So I would say you're right about Israel. Israel needs to decide what it wants, and it needs to have a vision for the future. And that's going to take some courage. It's going to take that vision. The Palestinians need to decide what they want as well. And I think that if there isn't that leadership on both sides, I do think you're going to see unilateral moves by the Israelis to try to end the conflict, try to sort of finalize the issue on terms that they find satisfactory.
Ms. Redmond?
Thank you, Congressman. I would add that I believe that there have been varying degrees of partnership.
Of what?
Of partnership.
Partnership.
So I think that it is important to note that while there has certainly been an inability to get a deal done, the responsibility for that goes to, I would put that a lot on Palestinians, I would put it some on Israelis, I would put it on the United States at various points as a facilitator as well, and on a number of the other international actors. Primarily on the parties, but I would not put it exclusively on the Palestinians. And I think that we as the United States could have done more at various points if we're looking backwards at reinforcing, for example, the Palestinian leaderships who renounce violence as opposed to those like Hamas who do not. So going forward, I take the lessons of what can we do to do more to get the kind of leadership who's able and willing to be a partner on this and reinforce those kinds of leaders.
I don't have much time, Mr.
Thank you, Congressman. I would just say very briefly that I think not enough thought has been given to what comes after Abbas. He's 85 years old. He's not in great health. And I think there's been a lot of criticism of him for not being a partner for peace, not, by the way, when they were sitting down with the Israelis in 2013-14, but I saw the Israeli ambassador yesterday saying nothing can happen until Abbas goes. When
My
Abbas
time's
goes,
almost up. I just wanted to say this. So it seems that Israel has tried time and time again. I don't blame Israel at all. It seems that it has wanted peace. It has wanted to figure these things out. It has made some hard decisions. And when it's made these decisions, it seems to have gotten missiles in return. And so I see why there's sometimes a reluctance on their part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Reschenthaler is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, but I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Connolly appreciates that, and I yield to him.
I thank the chair. And welcome to our panel. I guess Mr. Vargas and I and Mr. Zeldin and I have differences of opinion about what is best for Israel. We're all committed to the state of Israel, but I guess I fear that the Trump plan destabilizes the possibility of a peaceful settlement for a generation or longer. And I would also say that we can whistle past the graveyard all we want, but Israel being a permanent occupier of millions of people, as a military occupier, changes the character of Israel. It threatens Israel's democracy and democratic nature. For that matter, it threatens Israel's Jewish identity. And long-term, from my point of view, that is not viable, and it threatens support in the United States for Israel. A non-democratic Israel will lose support in America. So my concern is, how do we avoid those outcomes? And that means stop the blame game and stop taking pieces off the chessboard we need for a negotiated settlement. This administration unilaterally moved the embassy to Jerusalem. That may be a good move in and of itself, but in the context of a peace agreement, it removes a key piece off the chessboard and further alienates Palestinian leadership and their willingness to come to the peace table. Unilaterally declaring the annexation of the Golan Heights, Mr. Vargas may think it's a stupid thing to ever return it, but taking it off the table so that it is never going to be another peace for negotiation seems to me a tool we unilaterally gave up. The declaration by Secretary Pompeo that settlements in, beyond the neighborhood of Jerusalem, which I believe the United States position has always been were illegal, the international position has been are illegal. To declare them not illegal is to greenlight annexation. And in case we had any doubt about that, the plan, if you look at it physically, essentially does just that. It makes for a non-viable Palestinian entity. One hesitates to even call it a state because I don't know how it could be looking at the map, and apparently might even disenfranchise some Arab Israeli citizens because some of their neighborhoods are unilaterally in the plan given to this Palestinian entity. Mr. Lowenstein, if I'm right in my description, how does this help Israel's long-term stability and security? And what does it do to the peace process?
Thank you, Congressman. I would echo a lot of your comments on the concerns that we have all had for Israel over the long term if they continue down the path that they're continuing down. I don't know what's going to happen to 3 million Palestinians living in the middle of Israel without the right to vote over the long term. I would also say that I don't think Israel has a plan for that either. I really don't. I think they're just going to continue down the path they're going to continue down until the situation gets bad enough that there's some pressure on them to do something different. That's more or less what happened in Gaza. There's a lot of pain involved in that process, though, so I think our efforts have been hopefully to preempt that as best we can.
And given my limited time, could you comment on the Trump peace plan, which Mr. Zeldin would have us believe, well, it's just another plan. If you don't like it, what's your plan? But I think you said that plan is, the purpose of it is to provide a pretext for Israel to annex the West Bank and to move the goalposts. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, not annex all of the West Bank. I think annex 30% of Area C. I think that's the objective behind it. I think that's what they're mapping out right now. And again, I think it just entrenches a really permanent one-state reality on the ground there, for which I think will be deleterious to Israel's long-term interests and also to that of the United States, right? We worked for the State Department, and our concern was in many ways, how is the United States going to handle this issue in the fullness of time? And I think if the PA were to collapse or the situation were to turn into violence, I just don't know how the United States would react to that.
Ms. Rudman, did you want to comment in the time I have left?
Thank you, Congressman. My concern is actually not the long term for Israel. It's pretty close to the immediate. I actually don't think the status quo is serving Israel well. Right now, we're talking about a population, if you look at from the Jordan Valley to the Mediterranean Sea, of about 14 million people. That population in total is nearly half Palestinian, if you include Arab Israelis in it, and half Jewish Israelis. And so the decision about what kind of state Israel is, the Jewish state and a Jewish democratic state, is upon them. It's not a long-term future decision. And so the status quo and the pressure of these internal governance decisions on them is an everyday decision that they are making. And that has implications internationally, but it has tremendous implications domestically on the kind of state that they are, and for the United States as well in dealing with protecting us and protecting them.
Thank you, and my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Reschenthaler, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to my friend and colleague from New York.
Thank you to the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Connolly suggested that we have a difference of opinion on this issue, and he's right. And I think that it was a great decision by the administration to move the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. The Taylor Force Act, which was pushed through Congress and signed into law, was an important initiative that I was very supportive of. I don't believe that U.S. tax dollars should be going to the Palestinian Authority while they are financially rewarding terrorism and inciting violence. Taylor Force was a U.S. military academy graduate. This wasn't an Israeli. In that case, you have a United States military West Point Army veteran who ends up getting killed. The BDS movement is something that I very strongly oppose. I hear stories from coast to coast here in the United States of Jewish students being targeted with blatant anti-Semitism in the name of anti-Israel hate. And those stories are heartbreaking. People who go to class and a map of the Middle East gets put up on the wall where instead of it saying Israel, it says Palestine. They literally wipe Israel off the map inside of U.S. colleges. Now, I went through kindergarten through 12th grade, college, law school, 4 years of active duty. I never once experienced anti-Semitism. I never experienced these stories when I went to college, and it's heartbreaking to hear it now. I thought maybe my generation would be the first of many generations to have that experience of not experiencing, living through anti-Semitism. I never even had anybody around me telling me stories of how they were experiencing this inside of classrooms. When I hear stories of Hamas using women and children as human shields, or paying an individual money to go to a checkpoint and get shot. What we see on the border right now between Israel and Gaza is outrageous. I believe that we should be neutral arbiters and also honest brokers. I also opposed the UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which passed at the end of 2016, that for the first time the UN Security Council was taking a vote to determine it to be a violation of international law, the Israeli activity in Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem. At the time, in January of 2017, the House, with strong bipartisan support, passed a resolution condemning that UN Security Council resolution, which was a change in U.S. policy. We should have exercised our veto authority, and we didn't. And what Secretary Pompeo did, and a move that I agree with, is reversing that trend that we saw there at the very end of the last administration. There is a lot that I disagree with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, and it's a healthy disagreement. There are different perspectives. We have that probably amongst our three witnesses who are here, and that's okay. But I believe Israel is our greatest ally in the world. I'm unapologetic about that. I'm proud of our relationship between the U.S. and Israel. I believe that there's more that we can do to strengthen that alliance, working together to do PTSD research for veterans struggling from post-traumatic stress disorder, technological advancements, energy research, trade, security, intelligence. That relationship and strengthening between our two countries is something that we should be proud of. And while we're having this debate here today over a plan that was put out by the president and his administration after many years of hard work, I wouldn't want it to be lost that this administration at the same time did a number of other moves that I thought were very important for strengthening our relationship between our two countries. And I hope that as we go forward, no matter who the president is at any given time, looks for other opportunities to strengthen our alliance with the great state of Israel. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Connolly.
Mr. Chairman, surely my friend from New York was not conflating anti-Semitism and BDS support with a legitimate criticism of a so-called plan submitted by the Trump administration. This member is on record
actually, before you
as
put words in my
opposing
mouth,
this member's.
Mr. Connolly, it's Mr. Reschenthaler's time. Mr. Reschenthaler's time.
Mr. Chairman, it is normal to allow a member who has been personally singled out
Mr. Chairman,
for an attack to respond.
That is correct, Mr. Connolly, and you have, and I will yield back to Mr. Reschenthaler or Mr. Zeldin for response.
And I yield back to Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you. And to be clear, I absolutely am stating that college students have been targeted with blatant anti-Semitism in the name of BDS, and it's happening from coast to coast. It's happening, I give you stories on the East Coast from NYU and Columbia to Michigan State, where someone wanted to study abroad in Israel, but they weren't allowed to be granted permission to do that internship because the professor learned that they wanted to study abroad in Israel, or stories from UC Berkeley. I can inundate my friend from Virginia with stories of Jewish students who are being targeted with blatant anti-Semitism in the name of BDS, in the name of a legitimate criticism of the Israeli government. Someone is being targeted with anti-Semitism because they're Jewish. And we've seen it just play out here in the New York City area this past Hanukkah. Listen, I don't want this. This is a great hearing that the chair is hosting on the administration's proposal. And rather than getting sidetracked with a debate between Mr. Connolly and I, which I'm sure Mr. Connolly and I would be happy to do with respect to the chair and the ranking member and the witnesses, I'm going to yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Trone is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you like a minute?
I would, and I thank my friend for his courtesy. It is, to me, a very regrettable thing to try to conflate separate issues of anti-Semitism and BDS support, both of which, of course, all of us at this dais are on record as opposing. I've been proud to stand with my Jewish community in my district against anti-Semitic expressions that sadly have occurred. But it is perfectly legitimate in the context of firm support for Israel to criticize a plan that some of us believe long-term and maybe even short-term will actually be injurious to the interests of our ally, Israel. And it's unfortunate to me that anybody would attempt to tarnish such criticism with that kind of argument. And I thank my friend from Maryland for allowing me to defend my own good name.
Thank you. Like so many of my colleagues and constituents, I support a negotiated two-state solution to the conflict, giving us a democratic Jewish state, Israel, and a viable democratic Palestinian state. The people of the region deserve two mutually recognized states coexisting in peace and stability and security. We can all agree there has to be direct negotiations. We're disappointed the Palestinian leaders have disengaged from the talks. It's not helpful. But long-term, the status quo is not acceptable. Unilateral moves do not help the cause of peace. We know that Israelis and Palestinians deserve security and democracy, and it's not clear to me that President Trump's plan is the answer to the many challenges confronting the parties. To create the conditions for the two states, what exactly, Mr. Lowenstein, should Congress be doing?
Thank you, sir. Well, I think in the first instance, strong opposition to annexation by Israel would be really a critical step. I think that will really difficult to overstate how damaging that move will be to the prospects of a two-state solution. I think Israel is strongly considering it, maybe as soon as early March after their election. So I think, and I know many already have, I think legislation has been passed, but I would really emphasize how important that is.
Thank you, agreed. Second quick question is short term, the Palestinian leadership, they're doing okay financially. So since everybody there is fine at the top, Israel has short-term what they need, that's security. Long-term, it's not a solution, we agree. But the one folks that are left out of the Palestinian people, they're not enjoying what the leadership has, and they're not getting to revote anybody back in again. So what should the Arab states, Mr. Singh, be looking at doing to help out and step up? And what Arab states do you think should be participating to try and look at and addressing the Palestinian people who seem to be paying the price?
Thank you, Congressman. Look, the United States, the donor community have provided enormous support to the Palestinians over the years, billions and billions of dollars of support. My own sense is that the support that the Palestinians have received from their Arab neighbors has often been provided reluctantly, and often it's been too little. And so I would like to see the Arab states continue to provide the Palestinians with support. I mean, the plan looks forward to a day when the Palestinians won't require economic support. I think that day is probably a long way off. And so that needs to keep coming. And frankly, they need to look to support economic growth within the West Bank to the extent possible within Gaza, which could be important for stabilizing Gaza. And I think a lot of that needs to come from within the region. I mean, it's just a reality that, again, this issue is, as I said from the outset, diminishing on that list of U.S. interests, especially as we look more towards Asia, Russia, and so forth. So
let's try and nail that down. When you say Arab states, can you specifically say which states should have the means, the expertise, et cetera?
Well, look, the oil-producing states, I think, have the first responsibility. So you're looking at Saudi Arabia, the GCC states. I think the other Arab states have plenty to contribute, probably less financially than in terms of security help and so on and so forth.
And what's coming out of Saudi Arabia now, the kingdom? The help?
I actually don't know what's coming out from Saudi Arabia right now. The Saudis have contributed to different sort of campaigns for funding for the Palestinians, but I don't know the current state of it. I'm sorry, Congressman.
Ms. Rudman?
The Qataris are contributing substantially in Gaza, working with Israel to do that, and they were one of the countries that came in to fill the gap left by the United States with respect to Gaza, and they give some stuff on the West Bank, specifically to an innovative housing proposal there. And so at various points, and I was involved in working to get money from Arab countries during the Obama administration. So certainly they can do more. They are doing some things now. I would say that if we want to ensure that the Palestinian people see the benefits and that we are able to, we, the United States, use that to facilitate and leverage what we think is both for the Palestinian interest and the Israeli interest, we, the United States, need to be involved. So I would go back to your prior question about what Congress can do, and that is to use your ability to ensure that there is assistance that works in ways that serve the United States interests, ensure transparency, accountability, and reform, and give the United States the ability to be on the ground, working to manage both our own assistance and leverage the international assistance that can come in to ensure that the Palestinian people get what they need in the ways that work for them and work to the benefit of the Israeli side as well. And we've done that at points in the past, not necessarily successfully all along, but we have moments or longer periods of success in doing that, and we should be doing that again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trump. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized.
Thank you. The Israeli government seems to have welcomed the Trump plan, and even the parties on the right. For many decades, the position of the Israeli government has been that final status solutions or final status should be negotiated between the parties, and that there should be outside facilitation, but not an outside plan. Now that the Israeli government has accepted the idea that this U.S. president should put forward a U.S. plan, does that mean that Israel is okay with the next U.S. president putting forward a U.S. plan? Mr. Goldstein.
Congressman, if that was not a rhetorical question, I think the answer would be depends on who that president is.
So some presidents have the right to do certain things, and other presidents, it's wrong for them to get involved. That is an interesting reading of the American Constitution. So we have now opened the door where U.S. presidents, I think, in the future will be expected to put forward a U.S. plan. looking at this plan, it's, none of us would be alive today if the Palestinians had simply accepted it. We all would have died of heart attack and shock. But it does serve as a good opening position on the Israeli side. The key thing in the plan is it does provide for two states. Needless to say, the two-state solution that would be favored by the Israelis. But it's not exactly where justice and compromise would lie. On the other side, the Palestinians have, or at least the Arab side has put forward a two-state solution, which on its surface looks like a reasonable bargaining position for them, except for language somewhat vague about a right to return. This would mean that any Arabic-speaking person who claimed, there are no records, that any of their ancestors ever lived in the State of Israel has the right to return. Or, being that it's by vague language, it may mean that 400 elderly people get to move to Israel. When you have vague language, it could involve 40 million people or 400 people. What are our chances of getting a reasonable opening position put forward by the Arab or Palestinian side? Whoever wants to comment, I see Mr. Lowenstein. Mr. Singh.
I mean, I guess what I would say, Congressman, is so far the Palestinians have chosen not to engage with the Trump administration on this topic, and in the past they have been reluctant to put forward proposals of their own. So the likelihood that they're going to do so, I think, we have to rate as low. But look, I think the smart move for the Palestinians would be not to simply reject it outright, but to come forward with their own ideas.
Yes, I mean, if they don't like this plan, what's their plan? Mr. Lowenstein.
Thank you, Congressman. If I might just repeat what I said a little bit earlier, which is that President Abbas did go to the United Nations yesterday and propose a resumption of negotiations based on relevant UN Security Council resolutions, which I know from conversations with him, he's referring primarily to UN Resolution 242, which introduced the concept of land for peace. I also know they've embraced the Arab Peace Initiative and will repeat its terms often. Stayed on the 1967 lines.
And the Arab Peace Initiative would be it does provide for two states, but with that right of return language, maybe two Arab states.
Yes, sir. That is, not necessarily with respect to Arab states, but you're right that I think the primary stumbling block, in addition to Jerusalem, obviously, would be the refugees in the Arab Peace Initiative. But I just want to be clear, the Palestinians have repeatedly, as recently as yesterday, put forth their own proposal for the resumption of negotiations. So I think we just have to balance out who's right in terms of what the basis of those negotiations.
Well, usually when you go into negotiations, each side has a plan. And if each side's plan calls for two states for two people, that's close enough so that they can sit at opposite ends of a very long table.
Right, and sir, if I might just very quickly also add, there have never been agreed upon terms of reference for direct negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. We did not have an agreed basis for those negotiations when we got the Israelis and the Palestinians back to the table. That, as a threshold question on what basis are you going to be resuming negotiations, creates enormous hurdles to actually getting the parties back to talks.
Often in negotiations, each side shows up with its own plan. You don't have to agree that there's a base text and you're just going to suggest modifications. Mr. Singh, do you have a comment? I believe I'm almost out of time.
Well, look, I can't speak to what happened during the Obama administration. What I can say is that after 2008, when Prime Minister Olmert, who was at the end of his tenure, put forward a plan, there wasn't a response from the Palestinians. And in fact, Saeb Erekat, who was one of the negotiators on the Palestinian side, basically spoke of his pride in refusing to respond, in defying the ideas that were put forward in that plan, which is far better than, frankly, anything they're likely to get now. So I do think that this is going to require more from the Palestinian leadership than what Mr. Lowenstein has described.
I yield back.
Thank you. I will yield to myself. I agree with what we've heard, Mr. Lowenstein and Ms. Rudman, from the two of you and from so many of my colleagues about the problems with the plan. moving the populations of 3 communities unilaterally into a new country is terribly problematic. Unilateral annexation, if that step is taken, makes it impossible to negotiate toward a 2-state solution. Ms. Rodman, I completely agree. Maintaining a Jewish and democratic state is critical to Israel's future, and it is quickly reaching the point where that is at risk, and the 2-state solution is the way to preserve that. Cutting off aid, $200 million in aid, humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians, is a terrible idea. And it's a terrible idea that the administration should have to be accountable for. Creation of a state with all of these enclaves is hard to see how that doesn't interfere with a real Palestinian state going forward. I share all of those concerns. At the same time, there's a plan, and I'm going to get to my question in a second. There's a plan that says only the Israelis and the Palestinians themselves can make the decision to forge a lasting peace together. The final specific details of the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement must be worked out directly between the parties. That's something we all agree with, right? And then it says, then it talks about providing Palestinians with a legal status and international standing as a state. Al-Quds should be internationally recognized as the capital of Palestine. It's also in here. I understand the questions about what that means and where is it, and it is Jerusalem, it's not really Jerusalem. I understand the questions about the state and how is it really a state. I get all of those things. But my question is this: these statements, are you surprised that a document from this administration, from this president, who not that long ago said, 1 state, 2 states, whatever they want, it's fine, contains this language? Does it surprise you at all? And if it does, then how do we completely discount this with all those challenges that I talked about that are absolutely real? But how do we completely discount this, throw it out the window, and then think that we're going to get to the possibility of entering into negotiations before, Ms. Rodman, before it's too late, before there is no longer any chance for a 2-state solution? I'll start with you, Ms. Rodman.
So I think part of dealing with this conflict is holding multiple simultaneous realities in your head at the same time, and that is part of my response to this question. It does not surprise me that this plan has those statements. I salute those statements in this plan. I think it is a reflection of the fact that there was hard work put into this plan and that the people who worked on it actually did learn something as they were putting together elements of the plan, I think, absorbed some of what is important to the parties, whether or not they were talking to them as they were doing it. That said, I would come back to what is going to serve the United States and the parties' interests going forward now that the plan is out there. We're all used to facts on the ground. The plan is a fact on the ground. And so I do come back to some of the things that Mr. Singh said. I don't agree with all of them. But I would now look to figure out what we can do to move from an ultimate rejectionist position by the Palestinians without castigating them for it, understanding why they come to it that way, and build up coalitions that could be supportive of the elements that we think would work in the plan without making a full embrace of it a test case going forward.
Right. Right. I agree. Mr. Lowenstein, let's acknowledge the facts on the ground. No one, certainly very few of us here have fully embraced everything in this plan, and a lot of us have raised serious, serious concerns. But there's something there, no?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of what I saw in here. Much of the work we did on the economic front and on security was built into this. And I think the fact that they committed to 2 states is significant, although I would add that they had lowered the bar a whole lot to begin with. So the fact that we were surprised by them saying something was a function really of very, very low expectations. I would also point out that the state as described in here is really a logical continuation of Prime Minister Netanyahu's Bar Ilan speech. In effect, it's a highly circumscribed Palestinian state. So yes, it is one thing that they agreed to a two-state solution. If you read the fine print, though, the definition of that state really doesn't meet anybody's conventional understanding of what a sovereign nation would look like. So I would qualify it just a little bit.
So here's how I'll wrap up. You pointed out that Abbas said he'll negotiate on the Arab Peace Initiative. The Arab Peace Initiative talks about complete withdrawal from occupied Arab territories, including the Golan Heights to the 67 lines, and the territory still occupied in southern Lebanon. So that was where they were in 2002. So and I understand pursuant to 242, I understand all of that, but that's also not realistic. The question is if there's language acknowledging, to your point, Mr. Lowenstein, if there's language acknowledging that only the direct negotiations between the parties gets to the final specific details of an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, and you're right about the fine print. But if there's acknowledgement in the big picture that that's what gets us there, and that we need to work toward a two-state solution, and understanding that outside of this committee and some of the people who watch the work of this committee, most people don't dig so far into the fine print. Why isn't there some opportunity to go back to Mr. Abbas, who said 1,000 no's, and say, look, we all agree that two states, direct negotiations. You say you want to move forward on our peace initiative. Here's another one. Let's talk about all of the concerns that we've spent this morning talking about, and continue the conversation before the headline of a two-state solution is gone forever.
Oh, sorry, if I might just very quickly, on the API, we actually got the Arab countries to agree that the withdrawal of the 67 lines contemplated land swaps. And also, to be clear, he's not talking about the Arab peace initiative per se yesterday. He's talking about 242, which is incredibly general, as you know. It's withdrawal not from all the territories as Israel interprets it. I think your other question is really the right one, which is that what is it going to take to get the parties back to negotiations? And all I would say is that the United States, which has played an essential role in that process over the years, putting out a plan that so squarely sides with one side of the negotiation, it doesn't give the other side a whole lot of reasons to come back to the table. So I would argue that, sure, in theory at least, the Palestinians should put forth their own, maybe it's 242 or the Arab Brothers, and the Israelis would take this position and they go on and have a nice negotiation. As a practical matter, though, the Israelis are not going to agree to the Palestinian terms for resumption of talks, and the Israelis are not going to, certainly the Palestinians are not going to agree to Israel's version of it. So you have created no basis to get the parties back to talks through this process.
I will conclude with this. Mr. Rudman was right about trying to maintain multiple realities. It's hard for members of Congress, hard for people like me anyway, but using those multiple realities, you are right, but it is simultaneously true that if having those discussions about how to get back to the table means that we miss the opportunity to press this administration on a commitment to a two-state solution, then I fear that we may wind up in a position where that opportunity is completely gone, which I think we all agree would be the worst thing to happen for Israel, for the Palestinians, and for the United States. I thank the witnesses for their being here today. This was a really good discussion, really important and timely. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions, and we ask our witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. I ask my colleagues to submit any questions for the written questions for the record within 5 business days. And with that, the subcommittee is adjourned.
Thank you.